It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dennis Altman. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Karen. It's very exciting to be here, especially as it took me 5 minutes to find a building that, of whose existence I was only vaguely aware. And that, I guess, symbolises the reality that it's a few years since I've been full-time on this campus. I want to start by recognising that being a graduate student, particularly being a graduate student in arts and social sciences, is somewhat scary. It's scary because the environment in which we all live is one in which many of the basic values and principles that we associate with our disciplines has become increasingly hostile. And I'm very conscious of the fact that people coming into research, academia, university life at this stage are coming into a very different environment to the one that I knew and the one that existed here at La Trobe when I first came to this campus just over 30 years ago. At that time, there was a mythology that La Trobe was a radical university, and every now and then in the 50th anniversary celebrations, there have been attempts to revive the idea that somehow this is a radical university. And there may be people here who are wedded to the idea of being at a university that is different, that challenges some of the assumptions of what has been, after all, a very conservative tertiary sector. I think it's worth asking, and I'm not going to spend very much time on this, but it's worth thinking about what we would mean by calling La Trobe or any university radical. The way in which that mythology grew up had a great deal to do with student movements on this campus in the late 1970s. Whether the radical students of the time were more than a small number of the total student cohort seems to me a quite significant question. But certainly my experience over 30 years at La Trobe is that our student body has not been a particularly radical one, and that the pressures of work, pressures of money, the sheer pressures of getting to and from this campus have actually made it a reasonably docile campus. There have been moments, and I remember with great fondness an incident involving a previous Vice-Chancellor when a group of music students complaining about the closure of the music department turned up at a university council meeting, complete with their instruments, which they'd taken from the music department, and the then Vice-Chancellor, I shall name no names, the then Vice-Chancellor literally was scared to go outside and talk to the 12 students. What I think summed up for me both the politeness and the docility of the students was that on the dot of 8 o'clock they all left because they'd agreed to return the instruments to the music department by that time. But I think if we're going to talk about a university being radical, we have to actually look not so much at student activism, nor at the statements of university managers. We actually should look at how far the university stretches the boundaries of what is taught and what is researched. And the Faculty of Arts, which is essentially the founding faculty out of which most of your departments have grown, has a very proud history of pioneering a number of areas of study in Australia. Cinema studies, Latin American studies, women's studies, which has now become gender, sexuality and diversity studies. All of these, La Trobe played a major role in introducing into the tertiary sector. And I think it's important for us to remember that heritage, some of which, of course, is still available through the holdings of the Borchardt Library. But universities, as we all know, have changed enormously. Universities now have become essentially corporations. I was going to say not-for-profit corporations, but in fact, the constant demand that universities run surpluses makes one wonder if even the not-for-profit is still applicable. And given the way in which universities have become effectively large-scale corporations, run more and more along corporate lines, this presents real challenges for anyone working within a university. Now, you as graduate students are not necessarily that impinged by the very rapid changes that have gone on in the structure, management, and governance of the university. But certainly the academic staff with whom you will constantly interact are enormously affected by those changes. And I suspect that even graduate students have a strong interest in understanding the restraints, the limits, the rules through which everybody in the university now has to operate. And I also want to say that a lot of this is, of course, externally imposed. When you're in an organisation, you, of course, blame the people who are immediately visible. You know, you kick the person who's there. It's not as much fun as kicking Simon Birmingham because he carefully isn't on campus to be kicked. But I think it's important for us to understand the extent to which universities have been caught up in a cycle that is both externally imposed and then internally taken on board, so that managers, in a sense, become the willing exponents of a system that at some level they know is very harmful to much of academic life. Okay, so that's a larger and rather depressing picture of the tertiary sector. I'm not going to say more about that. Many of you in this room will know probably more about it than I do. I do want to say something, though, about the specific pressures that come and have developed for those of us in the humanities and social sciences. And I guess I want to note that one of La Trobe's great strengths historically has been precisely in humanities and social sciences. I always felt there was room in Victoria for one non-G8 university that actually sold itself. No, there was room for more than one G8 university, and there may be arguments about whether we should have G8 universities at all, but I'm not making either of those arguments. I think there's room for one non-G8 university that says humanities and social sciences are central to what we do, and we are going to be the best university in that area in Victoria. This is a hard argument to make in a current environment where there is an obsession with creating universities or turning universities into places that will ready people for jobs in the future which are almost invariably defined as being technological and based upon the STEM disciplines. And there is a huge rhetoric, I'm sure you've all seen it, about the importance of STEM, which is, of course, something that is essentially the preserve of the other college. Along with this, and perhaps more frightening and more immediately frightening for many of you, is this bubbling away of the argument that, well, research should meet the pub test. That is, the Minister for Education should take ARC applications, go down to the local pub, put them on the table and say, listen, mate, does this make sense to you? Should we be spending all this money to research ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, pub tests have their value. I guess they're good if you want to know what's the better beer. I'm not convinced they have much value for telling us what research is important or valuable or even useful. And if we think about it, all those words are in fact very complicated, because what is important, what is valuable, is more than just a gut feeling of someone who's half pissed. The fear I have is that, and there has been in the last few months, a resurfacing of the argument that, you know, the research grants should be measured against the pub test. And that is something that I think affects all of us, and we need to be worried about. Now, I want to respond to what I think is an increasing pressure to make us, to narrow us down to doing things that are immediately translatable into economic benefits, which is essentially where the government seems to be pushing universities, with two arguments. The first is that even if you want universities to prepare people for future careers, it's absolutely impossible to know now what a future career will look like in 20 years' time. In fact, I look around the room and some of you will still be working in 30 and 40 years' time. God knows, with the raising of the retirement age, maybe in 50 years' time. So the argument that somehow now we can prepare you all, and you can do your graduate degrees in ways that are somehow going to take you into secure employment for the rest of your life, just doesn't make sense. But I think more important is that a well-functioning society is a society that understands itself, and that the study of our society, of other societies, of our culture, of the vast variety and diversity of cultures, both within Australia and globally, is in fact essential if civilization is to survive. We only have to look at the current President of the United States, whose information about the world appears to come from late-night television and tweets, to see the dangers of not taking seriously a deep study of humanity. And I'm using humanity in the way that we have traditionally used it when we've talked about the humanities as disciplines that cover the full range of human, social, and cultural activities and imagination. In a recent book by Masha Gessen, The Future is History, she talks about the way in which the humanities and social sciences were deliberately destroyed during the Soviet period. And she says, if a modern country has no sociologists, psychologists, or philosophers, what can it know about itself? And what can its citizens know about themselves? And it seems to me that the really crucial thing that we do in all sorts of marvellous and diverse and different ways in the humanities and social sciences is we ask questions about things that are not taken for granted. We ask questions about the human imagination and the limits of the human imagination. I spent a really interesting couple of hours just reading through all the abstracts that are going to be presented at the conference, and what struck me was the extraordinary range. It's a geographic range. There are people working on a whole number, or in or about a whole number of places across the globe. But even more than that, it's a range of imaginations. And it's a range of imagination that I think is enormously important for managing a modern, complex society. So even if I'm going to use managerial talk, even if I'm going to say, yes, you know, your research needs to be relevant, I think that if we understand relevance to be much broader than turning something into a patent next week, then that is essentially what we're doing in these areas. And I think we have to constantly remind the Prime Minister, who likes, well, we don't know what the Prime Minister is talking about this week. At one stage, she'd like to talk about us being a creative and innovative nation. I think he might have forgotten that line, but presumably it'll come back. I think we need to remind him that being a creative and innovative nation is not just about industry partnerships and scientific discoveries. But there are certain implications that follow from us defending the traditions of the humanities. And as an aside, I'd say that social sciences at the Trobe has historically been very much on the humanities end of social sciences. We have not been particularly strong in empirical, statistical types of studies. And of course, in this university, as in I think now most Australian universities, psychology is not thought of as a social science. It is, in fact, over there in the other college, linked in with, I think, the School of Public Health. Is that right? Yeah. And I think this takes us to something really crucial. People in humanities use critical thinking, evaluation, careful reading, careful analysis, but we don't do it in the same way as natural and biological scientists. Our sense of evidence is different. And this is, I think, enormously important because we tend to fall into the trap, largely, I think, because of the way funding for research works, of believing that the, quote, scientific model of research is somehow superior, and we therefore have to squeeze what we do into formats that don't actually work for the sorts of questions we're asking. As a very simple example, if you publish an article in Nature or Science, this university will give you instant rewards. If you published an article in the New York Review of Books, I'm not sure that would even count as an academic publication. But I would hope that everyone in this room would understand that in the worlds in which we work, an article in the New York Review of Books is going to have more impact and is going to be more significant than a great deal of what we would be given academic credit for. And I'm very conscious, having spent a long time in the international AIDS world, and having been in a situation where I was sometimes the only person in the room without a biomedical background, become very conscious of the fact that there are different languages and that we have to resist being pulled into a language that we're not able to use and that doesn't have space for the sort of analysis, the sort of argument, the sort of logic, and the sort of writing, and I'm going to come to writing in a minute, that is central to work in the humanities. And I said I'm going to come to writing. I want to segue into writing by raising one particular conundrum that I think faces people today in the humanities. And that is, because we are working in academia, because there is great pressure, and you as grad students will already be feeling this pressure to write in certain ways, to publish in certain articles, to refer to certain sources, the great trap is we end up writing in such complex jargon that only those people who are in a very small subset of a discipline can really follow. And I think there are some real questions that I want to come to about how we think about writing and publishing. When I was thinking about what I could say to you, I realised that the main thing that strikes me, and I think pretty well everyone in this room, if you're not staff, are doing a research degree, right? Which means you're all writing. In the end, this is a piece of writing. It's a piece of writing based upon very extensive immersion in a particular subject. But the general rules, if there were such things, about how to write probably apply to everyone. And that led me to think a lot about, well, is there anything useful one can say to people who are embarked upon, in many cases, the biggest piece of writing that you've done so far in your lives? And as someone who, I know that we have a very fine program in creative writing, but it seems to me that everybody, in a sense, is a creative writer. If we are to take the ideas, the research, the findings, and make them understandable to a reader, we're actually not doing anything very different to what a novelist does. And writing itself is as important to a good thesis as is the collection of data and the analysis of argument. Now, I don't know that there are any particular rules that one can give people about how to write. It's the standard thing at writers' festivals that you sit up on a stage and there's a panel, and the panel has this very serious discussion about, the fate of the world and is the internet killing off sociability? Is there alien life out there? Whatever. And then we come to question time, and then we get the first question, almost invariably, is, do you have a special time when you write? Do you have a special pen? Is it okay to sit in a cafe and write? And people, quite rightly, want to know this. I think quite wrongly they go to writers' festivals if they think they're going to find it out there, but that's another issue. And it strikes me that there are only a few general things that are perhaps worth thinking about. One is, I think writing is like going to the gym. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. And the less of a hassle. And what strikes me from having experience of supervising graduate students is there's often this sense of, now I'm going to do all my research and then I'm going to go and write it up. And there's this sort of looming fear of I've got to write all this huge chunk up. Whereas I would say, no, write as you go. In fact, you don't necessarily know what research you really need to do till you start writing. But more importantly still, I think, is to accept that all writing is provisional. When Shakespeare finished a play, he didn't say Hamlet is the greatest play ever written. He said, okay, what's the next one? Now, it seems to me that if we accept that everything we write is provisional, it will be improved and it won't be perfect. And that is enormously important. There's a wonderful beginning of a story by Camus about a man who spent his entire life trying to get the perfect first sentence. And of course, he never got the perfect first sentence. Maybe the perfect first sentence does not exist, although both Jane Austen and Tolstoy seem to do pretty good at it. But my point is, if you keep writing, if you write as you go, it will infuse the research you then do, but it also starts making it much more manageable. And if you keep writing, that looming mountain of whatever it is now, 80,000 words, becomes far less oppressive when you realise that it's actually made up of a number of small bits that will change. Now, I know as a supervisor, we always tell students you have to have an outline. I think outlines are even more provisional than writing. Outlines change. They are not like the foundations of a building. You know, one would get very anxious if, when they're building a skyscraper, they've got to the 37th floor and they say, oh, you know, really we could change the foundations of this building. That wouldn't be a good move. But writing, you can. I have a very vivid memory of a friend of mine many years ago in Sydney, the week before he was going to submit his thesis, suddenly saying, actually, I think chapter 6 should be chapter 9. I don't know if he was right or not, but the point is you can do that. So don't feel imprisoned by outlines. Don't feel imprisoned by what you said at the beginning. You thought you had to argue, because as you develop, what you have to argue will change. The other thing I would say, and this again, I've been thinking a lot about supervising graduate students over the years, particularly supervising graduate students who then took their work and have done rather wonderful things with them. I think that it's really essential to know quite deeply why you have chosen this topic. After all, you have decided to spend between 2 and 6 years, I'm being generous here because I'm not sure what people are doing, in which your primary concern is this one piece of work. And you need to know why. For example, somebody might want to write, I think I'm picking a topic that nobody in this room is anywhere near, so that's okay. Somebody might want to write about the presidency of Millard Fillmore. I'm sure it was full of, you know, light and drama. I know very little about the presidency of Millard Fillmore, and if anyone in here is writing about it, please correct me. But the question I would have is why? What is it about this topic that so grabs you that you want to spend this amount of time and energy? And how does it relate to you as a person? And one of the things I used to say to graduate students is write a personal statement that explains how you came to this topic and why this topic has meaning for you. And you may not in the end include that in the formal thesis. But for you to know it and to clarify it, I think is enormously helpful. It's also helpful, I think, in relating to a supervisor. And when I was making notes for today, last week we had the marriage debate, so not surprisingly, I wrote down in my notes, marrying and divorcing a supervisor. This is a real issue. You have the right to both. And we haven't had to have a poll to establish those rights. Choosing a supervisor is something you'll all, I assume, already have done. And I think that by and large, most academic staff are pretty helpful. They are very willing to suggest, if they're not the right person, who might be the right person. But in the end, you have to establish a relationship with the supervisor that you feel will work for you. And it's not necessarily an admission of failure on either side to say after a year, look, I don't think this is working, and to negotiate divorce. Now, divorce can be acrimonious. Anthony may know who I'm talking about. There was somebody many years ago who I think married and divorced half a dozen supervisors for a thesis that, as I remember, never got written. And he and I had a particularly stormy and short-lived marriage, I'm afraid, as part of, not Anthony and I, but the student and I. But I think that I think it's actually worth talking to a supervisor about what is it that you want from a supervisor and what is it a supervisor can offer you. Because it is a very peculiar relationship. It is not a friendship. It is not a counsellor. Often you will know much more about your topic than a supervisor does. And by the end of the thesis, I'd be rather worried, in fact, if you didn't know a lot more about the topic than the supervisor does. And I think, again, there are no rules. And therefore, I think it's something where one needs to be flexible and open. And remember that the supervisor is also nervous. The supervisor is also stressed by a whole lot of other things going on in their lives. The supervisor is also trying to juggle lots of different things. And to that extent, being open about your concerns often allows the supervisor to reciprocate and to share with you, well, okay, maybe I can't actually help you in the way you need on this particular topic. Let's bring in a co-supervisor. I think we now all have, everyone has co-supervisors. Sometimes they will, it's very useful to just bring in a third person for one particular set of problems. There may be somebody that the supervisor is aware of who knows about something that wasn't necessarily foreseen at the time the thesis proposal was first set up. I want to end up by, because I don't feel that I'm necessarily the right person to give you lots of pragmatic advice, so I wanted to end up with something a little more theoretical. And that is to suggest that all of us working now in the humanities are in fact engaged in doing something that links the personal and the political. Now, the idea that the personal is political is, of course, has become a cliche. It's a phrase that came out of the feminist movement in the late 60s. And it's a phrase that I've thought a lot about in the last few months as the marriage debate unfolded. Partly because there was such an imbalance between the two sides, in that for many people on the yes side, that was, the personal was the political. For most people on the no side, it wasn't. And that imbalance is, I think, precisely why the idea of a respectful debate was so unlikely. But it strikes me that, and I'm not here doing a plug for the politics department. I mean, I would if under other circumstances, but that's not really the point. The point is that if we think of politics as involving power relations in the broader sense, and if we understand that part of power relationships is an understanding of how we see the world and who controls how we see the world, and understanding the very diverse and different meanings that different people give to their understandings of power and ideas, then in a sense all of us are engaged in something that is political, and all of us are engaged in something that at its essence is asking questions about the capacity of humans to create, to imagine, to treat each other both well and horribly. And one of the things that struck me going through the topics is how many of you are in a way addressing topics that essentially are asking questions about how humans interconnect and our capacity for both good and evil. And it struck me that what we do in the humanities and in the humanities end of social sciences, unlike what people do in lab-based research or probably in numerically based research, is rather like what doctors do. That is, doctors, of course, employ a great deal of measurable scientific data. They test your blood pressure. They listen to your heartbeat. They have many elaborate tests to find out what is happening in the body. But in the end, a good doctor knows that each patient is an individual and that understanding the individual requires more than the sum of all the empirical data. And it struck me that that is essentially what we in what we used to call the arts do. That we have an obligation to read, we have an obligation to think, we have an obligation to use all respectable or all responsible, reliable data. But in the end, we interpret it. And how we interpret it, we bring in our own sets of biases and prejudices and politics. And that's where, as I said, I think in the end, the power of humanities research is inextricably linked to how we write about it. Because if we don't find a way of writing about it, it will not stand. And so I wanted to end with a quote from a novelist, Neil Gaiman, who said, "The main rule of writing is that if you do it with enough assurance and confidence, you're allowed to do whatever you like." I think that's quite a nice slogan to have up there when you're feeling, I can't go on with this, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. You want to have questions? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. I think we'll all agree that was a wonderful talk, very inspiring for all of us. We have some time now for a question and answer session. We have about 20 minutes left. So, would anybody like to start with a question? Some brave person. He's given us some clues. You can ask what's his favourite pen. But if nobody has a question, I could start with one.
There's one over there.
Yes,
I have one. I'm staff, not a student, but how can we further... I'm staff, not a student, but how can we advance the argument in the public that STEM research is not the only important thing and is not the thing that we should be judged against all the time for whether what we're doing is valuable or not?
It's a really good question. I think I don't have an easy answer. I mean, I know the Academy of the Humanities has spent many years trying to figure out an answer to this. I think that it is, again, it is about pointing out over and over again that our national welfare and global welfare depends much more on our ability to understand each other and develop structures that enable conflicts to be resolved and promote greater equity. And these are not the product of STEM research. I mean, my feeling is that we're losing. You know, I think there is at the moment, you can get Brian Cox on television talking about how exciting it would be to go to other galaxies, and everybody thinks that's wonderful. I'm not convinced it's wonderful when we have people in their millions now fleeing the most appalling situations in Syria, in Burma, and of course, on a smaller scale, offshore our own country. So I think we have to just respond much more aggressively, in a sense. But part of it is we have to work within the university structure. We have to actually say, look, why is it that you reward people for nature and science above everything else? That's not equivalent to taking on Malcolm Turnbull, but it's an important part of the process, I think. I think Andrew had...
Thanks very much, Dennis, for a stimulating and wide-ranging talk. My question is about a development I heard about last week. I think it's the Ramsay Foundation, which has put in, I think, literally billions of dollars into a new program, which is going to be one of the New South Wales universities and one of the Canberra universities, to essentially about the glories of Western civilization. And one, if you've heard about that and what's your response to that, and secondly, the question is about what sort of humanities and what sort of arts matter. Is it just about ways of thinking, or is it about ways of exploration, or whatever?
I don't know about the Ramsay Foundation. So what this is to support Western.
It comes from Paul Ramsay, I think his name was, who was healthcare and the like.
Right.
His advisory panel has John Howard, Tony Abbott, Kim Beazley, Joe De Bruyn, and it literally is, my understanding is that billions of dollars are being put into this foundation and partnership with a couple of the universities.
Well, I don't know about it. Given the academic credentials of the people you've just named, I would be deeply sceptical. And I think that underlying that is, of course, the real point you're making, which is that there are vastly more civilizations to be understood than those of Western Europe, which is, I assume, what they're after. I think part of it is linked to something that we're in grave danger in Australia of losing, which is language and area studies. I mean, there's been a winding down in a lot of our universities of language departments, and I think that it is impossible to fully understand a culture if you don't understand the language. There's clearly an increasing assumption that, well, everybody's going to learn English, so what does it matter? And I think here, one of the things this university pioneered was the teaching of Spanish. We also pioneered the teaching of Hindi. Now, we're still teaching Spanish and Hindi, but with, as far as I know, very limited resources. And I would say that, again, going back to how do we make the argument, if we seriously want to go into the public sphere and say what we do is important, we probably ought to find ways of leaping on when Turnbull goes to Indonesia and says we need a free trade agreement and there's limited trade between Australia and Indonesia. This is the point to say yes, and we need therefore to be training a lot more people who are comfortable in both the language and the culture and understand the politics. I don't think the Ramsay Foundation, from what you tell us, is likely to be doing that.
Great, thank you. I think we have somebody at the back there.
Dennis, thank you. I really buy the argument that what we do is important. I'm really interested in what we do with that. We are living in a moment of a really entrenched neoliberalist agenda. You were in university in the 60s, I was in in the 80s, so I don't know, but around that time, I was in the 80s. We are the adults that let this happen on our watch. So I want to know, do you think that is just a phase or a swing of the pendulum? Or is it feeling like Vienna or Germany in the 1920s, leading up to something much more dark? And what kind of thing went wrong, i.e. what can we do differently now to actually claw back that agenda?
Wow. I'm not as I should have said that. I'm not as pessimistic as you are, and I'm not sure I buy the idea that it happened on our watch. I mean, I don't feel collective guilt for what happened. I think that I honestly don't know. I mean, I think I'd be fooling you if I said I've got answers. I think that because it's so easy to argue in any direction, and one can say, look, there's all sorts of evidence that very large numbers of people are unhappy with the implications of neoliberalism. In fact, I think that is probably an easy assertion to make. The harder question is then, well, what do they do with that unhappiness? Because we saw in the United States, many of them voted for Donald Trump. We see in Queensland next weekend, probably many of them will vote for Pauline Hanson. So just being unhappy with neoliberalism by itself doesn't necessarily produce outcomes that probably most of us in this room would be comfortable with. I think there is a lot of work to be done in thinking through the next stage. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that much of the response is one that harks back to solutions from previous generations. But as I say, I'm not as pessimistic as you are, and I'm certainly not as pessimistic about Australia as you sounded. I don't think this is like the 30s, but then I think no period is quite like previous periods. And as I've said this often, political scientists are second only to economists in being bad at predictions, so I really can't.
Thanks, Dennis. That was awesome. I've got a question about writing and the plurality of voices and the learning process of trying to speak in different tongues. Because I do agree with you, it's really important to have that participation in the public sphere and think of high impact in terms of writing book reviews and all of that kind of stuff. But I also am very aware that people in this room are writing PhDs, and that if they do go on to have an academic career, I do think there is still a place for the journal article, and I do still think there is a place for having complex arguments amongst your very narrow peers, because it changes the way in which you participate in the field of inquiry that as a PhD student you're meant to be making an original contribution to. So I'd just like you to comment on perhaps like learning to speak in tongues or the plurality of voices for different occasions and different media.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in the sense that, of course, one writes for an audience, and so I would still say there is a real problem when you're writing a thesis. You're writing for a very, very limited audience. You're essentially writing for your supervisor and your examiners. I think it's actually important while people are doing that, and maybe take up Carol's phrase of speaking different tongues, that you also think about writing other things for a quite different and broader audience. My sense is that they don't have to compete, that the one strengthens the other. I mean, there was something I was going to say and I forgot, which is, you know, we often argue, and this is, I think, the classic union argument, that good university teaching depends upon people doing active research. But I think we can also turn the argument around. Good research depends upon good teaching, because it's while you're teaching that you actually are forced to find ways of articulating your ideas and explaining your ideas to people outside that narrow audience. So I guess, I know it sounds a lot, you know, people get overwhelmed. I've got to write a thesis, and I'm saying, well, same time, you should be writing elsewhere. And you know, I'm a great believer in learning how to write quickly short opinion pieces, because I think that they have a great advantage in clarifying your thought and forcing you to make a simple argument quickly. My hunch is that then feeds back, not in the language, and Carol's right, you'll still use a different set of words, a different structure of sentences, but I think that, you know, it's like going to the gym. You don't just do one set of exercises, you do a range of exercises, and I think the same is true of writing.
Do we have any more? We have time now for about one or two more questions. Two quick ones or one more? No? Okay, I'll just, while you're thinking about that. Oh, sorry, Catherine.
Thank you so much for thank you so much for that, and thank you for that place where you were thinking about the pub test, and you were starting to sort of unpack that a little bit. As humanities and social sciences researchers, one of the things I think that's really significant about the pub test is that for most of Australian history, pubs were places that white men were able to be part of. Indigenous people were excluded, women were excluded, and to what extent does this judgment of ourselves by this really diverse cohort, does unpacking a pub test kind of put us, the very large number of women, the very large number of not white men in this room, also be part of judging whether what we do is valid?
Well, yes. I mean, what can I say? I agree with you. Although I have to say, I'm not a drinker, and so you know, I'm going to say something deeply improper. I'm struck by the number of women who get pissed in pubs nowadays. So, but I take your point. I mean, there's another. I think the pub test is. It's shorthand, isn't it? It could just as well have been the supermarket test. And a woman might have been more likely to have said the supermarket test than the pub test. I'm not sure. No.
I think it would have been really radical to have a supermarket test, and I would love to.
Okay, okay. So maybe as a class project, we will all go down to the massive Coles in Bundoora with your thesis topics and go round and ask for comments. I actually think this would be very disheartening and demoralising, so I'm not going to suggest it. There's a question up there.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. It's extremely heartening to actually get some encouragement to what we do, because it's often very hard, as you have rightly pointed out, in the current climate. I'm really interested in power structures and this notion of who controls how we perceive the world. Because it seems to me that with this shift that you have outlined from the culture of debate and academia in the late 70s all the way to now, there seems to have been this enormous drive in public language and in public discourse for less diversity and a more homogeneous way of perceiving the world. And I don't know what has caused that, but people in public debate generally, I find that there is great fear now in politics, in the media, of kind of straying too far from the accepted vocabulary, the accepted mental landscape, which seems to be dominated by economic language, by economic terminology. And I'm really interested in how we can break out of that, particularly as humanities students who maybe think that there are other spaces, other ways of perceiving the world, not just through this narrow neoliberal way of thinking about costs and profits. And so what is a way that someone who is interested in those other ways of being and speaking and debating, what is a way to break out of that and to introduce a willingness back into public debate to actually allow for something other than neoliberal thought?
Well, yeah, I think I probably disagree with your fundamental premise, and this may be because I'm older, and I therefore, my sense is that there's a much wider public debate in Australia than there was 40 years ago, but it's a more polarised public debate. It is too predictable. I don't like reading the Saturday paper because I agree with everything they say. It doesn't challenge me. I like reading the Saturday Australian because some of it is quite crazy, but sometimes it makes me think, okay, some of them are not crazy. They have to be, you have to respond to them. I think the big problem, to be honest, is often we become lazy. There is, I think, a diversity of views. Now, I think you're right that there is an obsession with economic indicators. But this is all, I mean, I can't remember a time when this hasn't been. For example, if the stock market goes up, this is reported as positive. Now, yes, it is positive. If you own shares in BHP and they went up $3, of course it's positive. Most people probably didn't own shares in BHP that day, though many more than we know might have through their super. So I think in that sense you're right. But I would argue that the greater danger is actually a polarisation where it becomes almost impossible to say, look, I don't agree with your basic political positions, but what you've just said makes sense. And what my side has said doesn't make sense. And I will say that during the marriage debate, I at times had to restrain myself enormously because some of the things that people who were on the yes side were saying I thought were just stupid. And it was obviously not wise or politic to say that. So I think we disagree. I think we half agree, and I think we agree that there is this enormous unquestioned assumption about how the economy works. But I would say that there is actually room for much greater debate, and that what is required is a greater willingness to accept that people whom we don't, that there are very few people with whom we will totally disagree, and there should be very few people with whom we will totally agree. But increasingly we're forced into somehow assuming that that's how the world works.
Okay, thank you very much. We're out of time for questions for the time being. If anybody wants to continue talking about any of these fascinating topics, you're welcome to keep talking during our morning tea time, which will be held upstairs on that 3.